Hello, Avi.
Hi.
You can hear me fine, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be hosting this conversation with you. And having watched the film, it's a really great honor to discuss the subject of occupation. And before we start, let me just make a quick announcement to people who are watching. Basically, I would like to welcome you to the Dharamsala International Film Festival. And in case you have not watched this movie, please go and watch it first and then come join the conversation. So I would highly encourage you to go and watch The First 54 Years, made by Avi Mograbi. Okay, Avi, I would like to start maybe with a very quick observation. When I was watching the film myself as a Tibetan, I basically, halfway into the film, I started thinking to myself, wow, this is the best film I've seen this year about China's occupation of Tibet. And I know you made the film very much about the Israeli occupation of Palestine. At the same time, it's a very universal kind of film about occupation in general, and I noticed that the testimonials that people give in the film are about the Israeli occupation, but the lessons that you have drawn, the insights that you share, they are very much out of any situation of occupation, I think, and not just the Chinese occupation of Tibet, but perhaps many other cases of occupation. So I wanted to start off with the first question about tactics in general, because you spend a great deal of time talking about the tactics of occupation, and generally, so right now we are at, watching the film at DIFF in Dharamsala, which is the main hub for the Tibetan exile community, a population that is very familiar with the loss of land, living under occupation, right? And in my community, we spend a lot of time talking about the tactics of resistance, how the oppressed people come up with different tactics of resistance, and not so much about the tactics of occupation, even though we should, there was a need to understand both types of tactics. And now you have done a really great job focusing on the tactics and strategies employed by the occupying force. Was there any particular reason why you decided to focus on the occupation through the eyes of the occupying power rather than the victims of occupation?
Well, yes, obviously, my involvement with the organization Breaking the Silence has led me there. This is an organization founded in 2004. I'm one of the co-founders and still a board member. And this organization has taken the mission to make the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, to make it visible to Israelis and others alike. You see, Israeli governments, ever since the 1967 war, ever since Israel occupied those territories, have made endless efforts to make the occupation invisible, to give Israelis the feeling that they have not occupied, but have returned to their old ancient country, to erase the borders, what we call the green line between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, to create a network of roads paved for Jews so that they can travel within the occupied territories without noticing or without seeing the Palestinian settlements, and so that they would get to their to the places where they're going, Jewish settlements, without encountering any Arabs, any Palestinians. So the idea of behind breaking the silence is to collect testimonies of soldiers who served in the occupied territories and to publish them. And this film actually made mostly of the Breaking the Silence archive of testimonies, which I've decided to use. I think that the testimonies of the perpetrators are you can't underestimate their value, because a lot of times, and I'm sure that you know it from your experience with the occupation of Tibet, many times the oppressor tends to undermine the testimonies of the oppressed, and to portray them as over dramatic, whereas and at least within Israel, testimonies of Palestinians are not taken seriously, whereas when the soldiers tell about the practices that they have used, the mechanisms, the procedures, then it gains a different kind of attention. So, and it's very rare that perpetrators reveal what they have done or testify while the conflict is still ongoing. Obviously, you remember South Africa's Committee of Truth and Reconciliation that could be formed only after the end of apartheid. And during apartheid, you could not imagine that South African police forces personnel would step forward and tell about their share in the oppression. So I think that the role of the perpetrator and its exposure from with the voice of the perpetrator is something that has a very unique strength.
Right. Thank you. Was part of your intention also to make the oppressor more transparent to the oppressed, or more vulnerable to the oppressed, in the sense that usually when we think about the occupying power, one difference between the occupying power and the occupied populace is, the occupying state is kind of a black box. It's hard to see what goes on in its mind or in its decision-making processes. So in our case, in the Tibetan case, for example, it's very hard to see inside what the Chinese government is thinking behind its policies or actions. And the fact that that particular decision-making process is a black box, that mystery makes it harder for us to resist or fight against it. But in your film, you have laid bare the motives of the occupying power, in a sense, the objectives, the logics of occupation, and at the same time, their limitations, their insecurities. Was that also partly in your mind when you were analyzing the motives and the intentions behind each of these tactics?
Yes, obviously, providing evidence is one thing, but providing interpretation or a point of view or a perspective is another thing, and it turns the testimonies into something of higher value, because you know, when you look at the testimonies without my intervention, without the expert who is leading the viewer through the abbreviated manual for military occupation, if you look at the bare testimonies, you of course understand how terrible the things are, but you have to ask yourself, why are they doing it? Why is the Israeli army, the Israeli government engaged in turning the lives of the Palestinians in the occupied territories to such a terrible life? Why are they torturing them? And okay, because we assume, and I hope you will agree, that the Israeli government or the Israeli military doesn't do it just for fun because they are sadists. You have to create the perspective that will allow you to watch all those testimonies within a certain goal that has to be achieved. What is behind, like you said, what is behind the black box of the Chinese government? What is lying there that is leading those governments to turn to oppression as a daily mechanism? And the answer, I would not try to answer. Sorry for the, if you ask me here in Israel, Palestine, is that Israel is what is described state, Jewish democratic state. And what does Jewish state mean? Jewish state means that Israel has to sustain a Jewish majority of population in the areas that it holds. Now, the population of the state of Israel without the occupied territories is 9 million, is about 9 million, 20% of which are Palestinians. If you add to millions that live in the occupied territories, in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, then you come to an almost balanced situation between the two populations, which is, of course, endangering the Jewishness of the Jewish state. So Israel has to keep this balance in its favor and make sure that it holds as much land as possible with as little Palestinians with rights, with democratic rights as possible. And this is why the Palestinians, Israel is acquiring as much land as possible in the occupied territories by building, founding settlements, etc. But it cannot afford to expel the Palestinian population of the occupied territories. So it keeps it in under occupation with no democratic rights. The Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza Strip are not participating in the elections. They cannot intervene in the legislation that determines how their life will be, which turns the situation into a kind of apartheid, like the one we had in South Africa only on different.
Right.
The rules are maybe different, but the basic of discriminating an ethnic group because of its ethnic origin is the same.
Right. Quickly, Avi, your internet seems to be a little bit shaky. Do you know, are you on? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
I'm trying to see if I can. I see I'm right now on.
Yeah, your voice is. Thank you, Avi. That was really interesting. I find the concept of taking as much land as possible while providing as little rights as possible. I find that really intriguing and compelling as a concept of a logic of occupation, or one of the methods of occupation. In the movie, when I was listening to your narration, because and I found the narration part, I don't know whether you call it narration or something else, but I found it very interesting because you kind of assume, you step into the role, or like the figure of a Machiavellian kind of advisor to the occupying power, right?
Yeah.
And I like the satirical kind of twist that you insert in what is actually a documentary type film. And actually, in between, when you come in and dish out your insights on how to make the occupation as effective as possible, I thought, I was learning so much about the Chinese government's tactics and tools and strategies that it uses in occupying Tibet. And I'm thinking about, the tools of domination, the divide and rule strategies, particularly by encouraging snitching, like you mentioned the word snitching, right? To break the social fabric of trust by turning people against each other, family members against each other, families against each other. And also you mentioned the administrative detention of innocent people, right? So when we think about all of these different tactics that, that are developed by all of these occupying powers and different states, there is a universality to these tactics. There is a similarity that emerges, and it makes one think, do the colonial states or the occupying states, do they talk to each other, and do they go to conferences where they share best practices in the art of occupation? Because sometimes we meet up with other people in the same situation and share resistance tactics with other movements, right?
Yeah.
But among the occupying powers, why do you think that there are these similar tactics and similar logics? Do they talk to each other, or is it just the structure that leads to the similarity and the universality in these tactics?
Well, obviously, we have not invented anything. We are only reusing tactics that were invented by others, or evaluate, or were developing during the generations. But first of all, yes, the occupiers talk between themselves, between each other, and sometimes even sell their years-long experience to younger nations. Israel has been doing this for many years in Africa, selling expertise of control, of oppressing, selling nowadays also selling lots of high-tech tools,
technology,
of
right?
Technology of how to be able to control the oppressed. But look, the sad thing is, or you can say the macabre thing is that Israel actually learned all those tactics, mechanisms, procedures from those who oppressed us, from the British. Because until 1948, Palestine was under mandate of the British Empire, and right. They I'm sure that if you would meet, well, they should be very old now, but soldiers who served in Palestine since First World War until 1948, they will identify themselves in the film as well, because all those tactics were already used by the British. And you know, it's terrible that at the time we were oppressed by the British, but we adopted all the anything that could be learned from the oppressor in order to go for the next step of oppressing others. Look, it's a lot of times you discover that battering parents were in their childhood battered children.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you know, it's really disturbing, because you assume that when you go through hardship, where now you, the Tibetan people, go through a hardship, that there is a lesson that you will learn right. for the future when you will be free. Because right. if the lesson is that once you have grown from being a battered child, you become a battering parent, then oh shit, history, we don't need history.
Itself. Right. Yeah, I think you mentioned the lessons, the ironic lessons one learns from one's former oppressor in that sense. And one thing that I wanted to point out about this film, and for people watching in Dharamsala, especially among the Tibetan communities, and I think you may already be familiar with it. Among Tibetans who are in exile, there are many people who empathize a great deal with Israel, actually. Even as there are many Tibetans who empathize and sympathize with the Palestinian cause, right? And the ironic thing is, you know, Tibetans have heard so much about the suffering of the Jewish people. They have heard about the Holocaust. They have heard about the centuries and centuries of living in exile without a homeland, and that story of being in exile, being stateless, really connects or resonates with the Tibetan population in that sense, right? So Tibetans are, in a sense, primed to be sympathetic to the Jewish people, and therefore, by extension, to the Israeli population in that sense, right? But at the same time, right now, the awareness that many people are beginning to have is actually right now, it is the Palestinians who are more similar to us in the current situation because of the dispossession of their land and also living under occupation and oppression in that sense. So what this does is it makes me curious to understand a bit more about the younger generation in Israel and how they look at the occupation. And that goes to breaking the silence or as an organization, and the people who have joined Breaking the Silence. And in a way, I think in the film, and also I've noticed that you talk about how Breaking the Silence, because of the work that it does and all of the, people who testify to this occupation, they have been demonized in Israeli society. They've been demonized by the Israeli government. They're being called traitors, right? Because they criticize what the state is doing. And I think it takes so much courage. It takes a great deal of courage for somebody to criticize their own community or to criticize their own country. In your case and in the Israeli case, for many of these people, when and how did the awakening of the conscience begin? If you can speak to that a bit more, because I'm personally, I'm really curious about how that happens in an individual, going from taking for granted what you have always been taught in your own nation and community, and starting to question that when you see evidence that go against what you have been taught. And then finally having the courage to come out and say, what we have done is not right, and what we are doing right now is wrong. How does that process begin?
Well, of course, each and every person has their own story or their own history. And it's something that it's very difficult to generalize on. But I'll try to tell you about the founder of Breaking the Silence, the young soldier that was released from service in 2004 and decided that something needed to be done. Yehuda Shaul is his name, and he comes from Jewish Orthodox background, and during his high school years, he went to boarding school in a Jewish settlements in the occupied territories in the West Bank. So he had no doubts about his military service when he was recruited. But then, but this is a person who also had no doubts about his Jewish values, about not doing wrong to the other that you won't want to be done to you.
Yeah.
And during his service, he found himself serving for almost 2 years in the city of Hebron, in the town of Hebron, in the West Bank, which is a town of 70,000 Palestinians and a small post of about 700 Jews implanted inside this big Muslim town that actually have changed the life of the Palestinians there because of the endless number of troops that need to secure the lives of those Jewish settlers. And Yehuda Shaul spent almost 2 years in Hebron as a soldier, and he never refused an order. He was a wonderful soldier, you can say, but the day he finished his 3-year service, he came out and with the understanding that something has to be done, that this cannot continue. And he came to Mickey Kratzman, who is a photographer, a very high-profile Israeli photographer, came to him with disc on key full of photographs that him and his peers have taken during their service in Hebron, and he asked Mickey to help in curating an exhibition of those photographs. And later, Mickey invited me to join when there was a need to help also with collection and editing of testimonies of Yehuda and his peers. So this is one story. Each person has his own story. Obviously, when you look at when you watch the film and you see some of the veterans talking about things that they have done, it is very clear that they're talking about their own traumas as well.
Right.
The idea of the film is not to deal with the soldiers' trauma at all, and Breaking the Silence neither deals with the soldiers' trauma. We are dealing with the deeds, the actions, the mechanisms, the procedures. But you like always, when you meet someone, you see through his eyes, you see through his body language. Even though he doesn't reflect on what he has done, a lot of times you can follow the unspoken, the unverbal reflection.
Right.
So it's very clear. I don't know the personal stories of each and every of the witnesses, but it's very clear to me as a viewer that many of them were moved, not only emotionally, but moved politically, moved physically by the things that they've done, by the actions that they have been part of. And this was a start of change on their side.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really important part of any occupation that is sometimes difficult to notice, which is the trauma that the occupation inflicts on the oppressor as well. And I remember actually there was a manual that the Chinese government was giving to its soldiers in 2009, 10, especially around 2011 and 12, because there was a wave of Tibetan self-immolation protests during those years. And altogether between 2000, there was the uprising in 2008, and following the uprising from 2009 until 2017 or 18, there were more than 156 Tibetans inside Tibet who self-immolated. And apparently Chinese soldiers or troops were being traumatized by having to extinguish these fires or having to be on guard in those places. And the Chinese government had given them some kind of a manual on how to deal with trauma, you know. And that was a really interesting moment when this came out. It was an interesting moment for Tibetans to see the cost of occupation in that sense, the psychological cost of occupation on the Chinese soldiers. And I wish there would be more people who pursued that kind of line of inquiry and you know, hopefully reveal more in that sense. Because I think Chinese people need to see that, right? Just like the Israeli population need to see the trauma or the cost this has had on the Israeli soldiers in that sense. Because and also the other thing that I noticed in the film, one of the themes that stood out for me is the idea of normalization. Now, looking from the perspective of the occupied people, when a certain kind of life becomes normalized, when repression becomes normalized, when oppression becomes normalized, you know. And there was actually a really interesting story in your film where one former soldier talks about the moment when at his checkpoint, they stopped a father and they stopped a carpenter and a child who was traveling together, right? They stopped them for the night for no reason, took them out and tied them up to a tree and basically prevented them from going home. And, like he had this really interesting moment of self-reflection about, how when he himself goes home, if he's 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late, he has to send a message home saying, hey, I'm running 15 minutes late. But this Palestinian family have no way of doing that, no means of doing that. And it probably never occurred to them to do something like that. So in the same land, in the same country, in the same region, in the same context, two different people have two completely different lives. They are living parallel lives in parallel universes, right? The daily humiliation, the friction that is inserted into one's life, right? The checkpoints, the threats. I've heard stories about some of our friends in Lhasa where, somebody, that I personally know was detained in 2007 or 2008, actually. They were detained, and they were detained for a very short time, just a week, right? But all of their friends started getting interrogated, right? And eventually the government or the authorities didn't do anything to any of them. But the fact that all the friends were interrogated, now nobody wanted to stay friends with her, because everybody said, okay, now you are trouble. You are trouble.
Yeah.
We don't want to have anything to do with you. She hadn't done anything suspicious, but it was just the fact that of the administrative detention plus the bureaucracy of the interrogation, her life became unlivable, that she eventually had to escape and go into exile, right? And I wonder if you can just speak a little bit more about the motives and the intentions behind these seemingly benign administrative detention, bureaucratic kind of interrogation that do not really appear to or intend to torture somebody in that sense or imprison anyone. They let you go, but why do that? Can you speak a bit more about the motive intention behind these seemingly benign tactics?
Yes, look, when Israeli officials talk about normal life or normalization in the occupied territories, they say if the population will be calm and will not resist, then they could have a real normal life, go to work, go to school, etc., etc. Whereas what we learn is that normal life in the occupied territories means living with endless oppressing measures that are imposed on you, like, for instance, this poor carpenter who took the wrong road at the wrong time, only to tackle a checkpoint, a temporary checkpoint that held him for the night because they couldn't afford to let him go further and tell others that there is a checkpoint there. So it was not about him. It was about keeping the checkpoint secret. But this is normal, and people are detained sometimes for short and sometimes for long periods. Also, the detention is also very normal, and the idea behind the interrogation of your friends is what the Romans called conquer and divide. In order to rule, in order to control, you need to dismantle the social fabric.
Mhm.
And this can be done in many ways, but one of the ways is by turning people one against the other. You mentioned snitching earlier, but also when a person is marked as someone who can cause trouble, then obviously the society, the community around him takes caution from being involved with this person. And yes, one of the goals of the occupation of the secret services of the occupation is to turn people suspicious against each other, which becomes a power of the ruler. If you cannot trust the person next door, then I gain from this.
Right. One of the other themes that I found very compelling and resonant was a particular moment, not any particular kind of tactic, but you speak about, in a way, almost like stages of occupation. And you, meaning your role as the Machiavellian advisor, you talk about a particular stage in the occupation when it becomes clear to the oppressor that there is not going to be complete victory anytime in the near horizon. They're not going to defeat the enemy completely. It's going to be very difficult. And that, that made me think of a particular situation, sometimes a kind of standoff, because there are people who look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation and see an occupation that is very much unfolding in real time. That is, there was something very raw about that occupation, right? Somewhat different to that, when somebody looks at the Chinese occupation of Tibet, of course, many people can still observe and see that this is an occupation that is still unfolding because the story is not over. Many other people tend to look at the completed highways, the completed railways, the huge buildings and the big infrastructure, and come to a different type of conclusion that, oh, this occupation has become so asymmetric. The relationship has become so asymmetric in the power balance that Tibetans just have no chance of expelling or ending Chinese occupation, right? People come to that conclusion sometimes. But, every once in a while, you come through a story where the standoff is defined by a different kind of relationship. And what it reminds me of is this courageous political prisoner, late political prisoner called Palden Gyatso. He was imprisoned for 33 years for taking part in protests, right? And he probably was tortured more than any other person. The kind of tortures that he went through, physical. And one time, and many of these tortures was basically a game where the torturer, the prison guard, would say, you can end your torture right now if you would just say from your own mouth, Tibet is part of China, right? That's the end of the torture. I will stop torturing you. But he just would never say that. He would never say that. And one time somebody asked him, why did you never say that? You don't have to mean what you say. You can just say something, make up these words without meaning it, and that'll be the end of your torture. Why wouldn't you say that? And his answer was that, as long as he refused to give in, as long as he refused to say those words, the battle between him and the prison guard, he was winning that battle. He was ahead, actually, because the guard couldn't let him do what he wanted to make Pauline Gyatso do, right? But the minute he said those words, even if he would be able to end the torture, it somehow means that he lost that battle, the standoff, right? I found that really compelling. Is that a kind of a dynamic between the oppressor and the oppressed that you notice at the Palestinian level as well? And the scene that I described is very much happening inside a prison. It's between two individuals. But is that a scene that's reflected at the collective level between Israel and Palestine in general?
Yes, but this is really not in the, I think, on the individual level, but rather on the higher political level, where in different points of negotiation, Israel demanded that the Palestinian Authority will declare or will accept in writing within the future agreement that Israel is a Jewish state. It's very funny if you think about it, that a huge power that is holding 5 million people under occupation needs its approval of being what it is anyway. By the oppressed, and it's part of some kind of a perverted logic, because at a certain point the oppressor attributes to the oppressed powers that it doesn't have, and also satanic powers that obviously fuel the next step of violence that is going to be imposed on the oppressed. But it's very strange how when we oppress someone, he becomes powerful, also in our eyes, which is perverted, of course, but this is for psychologists,
right? And I think the psychology of oppression and occupation also, you actually break it down very well in the film, because even if you may not say this directly or explicitly, when you were speaking, in my mind, it made me think about this strange competition between the oppressor and the oppressed. And one of the ironies may be the fact that, the oppressed, whether at the political collective level or whether at the individual level, the oppressed may envy the oppressor his power, right? They want his power. At the same time, the oppressor may actually envy the oppressor or resent the oppressed for his dignity, as long as they are resisting, and that's what was going on in my mind while listening to your commentary in the movie. So let me ask you a final question, more of a advice-related question that can be directly relevant to people who are living under occupation. We are, in the Palestinian case or in the Tibetan case or in many other regions around the world, people who are living under occupation always are curious about, they want to know certain things. And one of those things is, what is the thing that drives the occupier most insane and most crazy? What is the thing that the resistor or the occupied people can do that just bothers them the most, right? I know that, George Orwell in his essay, Shooting the Elephant, to give one example, he talks about his time in Burma when he was serving as a colonial officer for the British Empire, right? And he writes about how his main concern while being in Burma was he was terrified of being laughed at. He was terrified of being ridiculed by the locals, by the natives or by the villagers. And in that essay, the biggest thing that the officer worries about is, having no control over what the villagers were saying behind his back, what they were gossiping about, what they were laughing at, how they might be ridiculing him, right? This was something that the officer had no control over, and it just drove him nuts. It drove him mental, right? Along the same lines, for people who are living under occupation today, if there was one example that you could give, maybe, a couple of examples, so, you can abstract the situation as well. What do you think is something that really drives the occupying people or forces completely crazy?
Well, you said it yourself earlier, the dignity of the oppressed. The fact that the oppressed refuse to be erased, refuse to stop aspiring for liberty, for freedom. I think this is the main thing. The oppressor, if you look at, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you look at the huge amounts of money and arms that Israel is investing in maintaining the occupation, it's obviously one of Israel's biggest financial economic burdens. And yet they don't bow. They don't bow. The Palestinians don't lower their head in I don't know. I'm missing a word here, but they don't bow to the master. And I think that, for instance, earlier you mentioned administrative detentions. Mm-hmm. Every now and then, including now, there are Palestinians who are held under administrative detention for months and months and months without knowing what they are accused of, without only the judge see the secret reports from the security services. And even his the detainees' lawyer cannot view them. And at a certain point, some of them turn into a strike, fast strike, food strike. They stop eating, and stop eating for months
on the strike.
On a strike,
yeah,
and at a certain point, because Israel cannot afford to have an administrative detainee die in prison, at a certain point, there's a negotiation starts concerning his detention, and eventually some kind of a settlement is arranged, so that he could, he will stop his strike and gain back his freedom. I think this is driving the oppressor crazy. The thought that the individual, the individual oppressed person is willing to pay with his own life in order for gaining liberty. This is driving the oppressor crazy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was in Palestine for a very short time, a long time ago, and I got a chance to see with my own eyes the walls that you talk about in the movie, and the daily slight and the humiliations of going through the checkpoint. I can see the parallels to other situations of occupation as well. And I got to say, the way in which the Palestinian people continue to resist, the way they continue to fight, the way they continue to preserve their dignity. They have set a great example to the world. I think they've set a great example in courage. They've set a great example for other people living under occupation elsewhere. And I also want to take a moment to actually express my admiration for the former Israeli soldiers from the IDF and other institutions who have actually joined breaking the silence and come out and in criticism against the occupation. As I said earlier, I think that sometimes when I see Chinese people who have come out in support for the Tibetan cause and criticize the Chinese government, they get vilified by their own community. And I can see the amount of courage and dedication it takes for somebody like that to take the step that they have taken. That's why I really admire the people who have come out and given the testimonials in your film. And most importantly, I wanted to thank you for making this great work of art, work of reality, because I think in doing this, you have given us a window into the mind of the oppressor in a very interesting, entertaining, compelling, and moving and tragic way at the same time, But as I was talking about the black box of the mind of the oppressor, it doesn't get cracked very often. It doesn't become transparent very often. But what you have done, and I want everybody to see this movie, because I think you have presented such a clear window into the mind of the occupying power, their vulnerabilities, their insecurities, their limits, their motivations and intentions. And my request to you is, can you actually make a next film about a manual for resisting occupation? I think that would be a great project to think about, something that's a little bit more direct. And I say this in jest, but also in reality, because I think the skills that you have deployed in making this really great collection of lessons for people living under occupation is quite invaluable. So I just want to say, on behalf of the Tibetan community, on behalf of the Dharamsala International Film Festival, and also on behalf of the founders of DIFF, Tenzin and Ritu, I just want to take the moment to say thank you, Avi.
Thank you, Tendor. In view of everything that you just said, I look forward to the day when we will start hearing testimonies from Chinese soldiers about their role in the occupation of Tibet. I'm not sure that the manual for resisting an occupation should come from someone from within the occupying community. This will be an irony in itself. But yes, I'm sure that if human rights organizations in China would want to acquire knowledge of concerning the collection of testimonies from soldiers that breaking the silence, that will be very happy to share this knowledge and help create the infrastructure for such a movement.
That'll be
so
amazing.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for screening the film. And thank you for this great opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Avi. And thank you very much, Radha, for facilitating and coordinating this.